The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, and it changed everything Henry Ramsey thought he knew about the life he had built with his own two hands. He had been out at the east fence line when his ranch hand, a wiry young man named Colt Davies, came riding hard across the scrub and yellow grass with a sealed envelope held above his head like it was something precious or something dangerous. Henry wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his glove and squinted against the bright Arizona sun. The sky was the kind of blue that had no patience for bad news, but bad news came anyway, and it came in the shape of that envelope with the Tucson Territorial Bank's emblem pressed into the wax seal. Henry was 31 years old, broad across the shoulders, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that curled just slightly at the ends from the sweat of hard work. He had never been what anyone called a handsome man in the polished, parlor-room sense of the word, but there was something solid and honest in his face that people trusted without quite knowing why. His hands were rough. His boots were worn at the heel. His ranch, the Double R, sat on 400 acres of decent grazing land southeast of Tucson, land he had bought acre by acre since he was 22 years old and had arrived in Arizona territory with $60 and a second-hand saddle. He read the letter twice standing right there in the field, the dry wind pulling at the paper. The bank had called in his father's old loan. Not his loan, his father's. Gerald Ramsey had died 3 years prior, leaving Henry the ranch along with a debt Henry had not known existed, a debt Gerald had borrowed against the deed before the illness took him, money spent on a failed silver speculation that had returned nothing but dust and heartbreak. The bank had been patient, the letter said. The bank had been generous, but the final note was due, and if Henry could not settle the balance by the end of the following week, the deed would revert to the bank and the Double R would be sold at auction. Henry stood very still for a long time. Around him, the cattle moved slowly through the grass, unbothered by the collapse of a man's world. He rode into Tucson that afternoon. The bank manager, a thin, precise man named Mr. Aldous Webb, sat behind his desk with the expression of a man who had delivered many such verdicts and had long since stopped feeling them. He confirmed what the letter stated. The debt was real. The deed was at risk. The balance owed was $420, a sum that might as well have been $4,000 for what Henry had in cash on hand. There is one exception written into the original loan document, Mr. Webb said, adjusting his spectacles and looking down at a page full of dense printed language. Your father negotiated a family clause, Mr. Ramsey. It is an older convention, but it is legally binding. If the deed holder is married by the time of the final note's due date, the bank agrees to restructure the loan over a 10-year payment schedule rather than demand full settlement. Henry stared at him. Married. Legally wed, yes. It was your father's idea, I believe. He anticipated you might need the flexibility. He seemed to think you would have a wife by now. Mr. Webb allowed himself a small, thin smile that held no warmth in it. The final due date is 1 week from today, Saturday next. Henry rode back to the Double R in a silence so complete he could hear the blood moving through his own veins. He sat on the porch that evening as the sun went down behind the Rincon Mountains and turned the sky into something that looked painted, shades of orange and deep red and dusty purple, and he tried to think of the problem the way he would think about a broken fence or a sick steer. Something with a clear solution if you looked at it long enough. He was not a man given to self-pity, but he was also a man who had not courted a woman in 3 years, not since Clara Whitfield had married a land agent from Flagstaff, and that particular door had closed quietly behind him. He was not the kind of man who went to socials or dances. He worked. He managed the cattle and the hands and the fence lines and the water rights and the endless calculations of survival that a working ranch demanded. He had not made time for the softer things, and the softer things had not waited for him. 1 week. He needed a wife in 1 week. Colt Davies found him on the porch the next morning and listened to the whole story with the patient attention of a young man who understood that sometimes listening was the only decent thing you could offer. Colt was 24, with a redhead's freckled face and an easy grin that he kept carefully hidden whenever the moment was serious. This was a serious moment, so the grin stayed away. "You could ask Dorothea Crane," Colt said carefully. "She's been widowed 2 years and everyone says she's looking." "Dorothea Crane is 53 years old and has 7 grown children and a temper that would make a rattlesnake nervous," Henry said. "Well, there's Maggie Oates." "Maggie Oates is engaged to the blacksmith's son, has been since February." Colt thought about it. "Miss Patterson at the schoolhouse. She left for her sister's place in New Mexico last month." Colt had no more names and they both knew it. The truth of it settled between them on the porch like the heat of the day, uncomfortable and unavoidable. Tucson in 1882 was not a small settlement any longer. It had proper streets now, and a newspaper, and a railroad connection that had arrived just the year before. But the population had its own arrangements already made, its own pairings and engagements and widowhoods that did not include a sun-beaten rancher with a week to spare and a legal necessity where romance should have been. "The notice board," Colt said finally, "at Mrs. Dunbar's boarding house. Women post notices sometimes, looking for situations." Henry looked at him. "It's not the worst idea I ever had," Colt said. It was, arguably, not the best idea anyone had ever had either. But Henry rode into town on Wednesday morning and went to Mrs. Dunbar's boarding house on Pennington Street, a 2-story adobe building with a wide front porch and a wooden board beside the door where notices were pinned with thumb tacks. There were notices for laundry services and piano lessons, and a room for rent, and a woman named Mrs. Holt who was selling preserves. There was not a single notice from a woman in any situation that resembled what Henry needed. He went inside and Mrs. Dunbar herself, a large, comfortable woman with gray-streaked hair and the manner of someone who had seen everything twice, looked at him over the rim of her spectacles. "You need to speak with Helen Pritchard," Mrs. Dunbar said, before he had finished explaining himself. Henry stopped. "I'm sorry. Helen Pritchard, she's been boarding here 6 weeks, came down from Prescott after her father passed. She's been looking for work, but there's not much for an educated woman out here that doesn't involve teaching and the school's filled. She's sensible. She's decent. She's 26 years old and she's not foolish, which matters." Mrs. Dunbar set down the cup she had been holding. "She also needs a situation, Mr. Ramsey. Not to be dramatic about it, but she's running low on funds, and she hasn't said it out loud, but I can see it in how she eats." Henry turned his hat over in his hands. "I can't court a woman in a week, Mrs. Dunbar." "Nobody's asking you to court her. I'm telling you she might listen to a practical arrangement." "A practical arrangement," Henry said slowly. "You mean I go upstairs and ask a woman I've never met to marry me?" "I mean you go upstairs, introduce yourself like a gentleman, explain your circumstances honestly, and let her decide for herself. She's an adult woman with her own mind. Treat her like one." Mrs. Dunbar pointed at the staircase. "Room 6. He stood at the bottom of those stairs for a full minute before he went up. He knocked on the door of room 6 and waited, turning his hat in his hands again, and when the door opened he was not prepared for Helen Pritchard. He did not know exactly what he had expected. Something worn down, perhaps. Something tired in the way that hard luck wears people down. He had not expected the woman who opened the door to have steady gray eyes that looked at him with immediate, intelligent assessment, or dark hair pinned neatly back with a few loose strands at her temple, or a posture that said clearly she had not yet let her circumstances bend her spine. She was of medium height, slender but not frail, in a dark blue dress that was clean and well kept even if the hem showed signs of careful mending. She was, in the most precise and unornamented way, beautiful, though Henry did not think that word in the moment. He thought capable, he thought, she looks like someone who does not give anything away for free. "Can I help you?" she said. Her voice was measured, not cold but measured, the voice of a woman who had learned to take the measure of strangers before deciding what to give them. "My name is Henry Ramsey," he said. "I ranch southeast of town. I know this is going to sound like something from a bad dime novel, and I am sorry in advance for that." A fraction of something moved across her face. Not quite amusement, not quite wariness, something in between. "Go on," she said. He told her. He told her all of it, standing in the hallway outside room 6 of Mrs. Dunbar's boarding house, because it seemed dishonest to make her invite him in before she knew what she was dealing with. He told her about his father's loan and the bank's letter and the marriage clause and the 7 days. He did not embellish and he did not minimize. He spoke the same way he would describe a drought or a fence problem to Colt Davies, plainly and without drama, because dressing it up would not change what it was. When he was finished, Helen Pritchard looked at him for a long moment. "How much is the debt?" she asked. $420. "And the restructured loan over 10 years, what would the annual payment be?" He had not expected a numerical question. He found himself pulling the figure from memory. Roughly $48 a year after interest. She nodded slowly, calculating something behind those gray eyes. "Tell me about the ranch," he blinked. "I beg your pardon. Tell me about the ranch, the land, the cattle, the operation. If I am going to consider this, I need to know what I would be walking into." Henry stood a little straighter. She was not saying no. She was also not saying yes. She was doing exactly what Mrs. Dunbar had said. She was thinking for herself. 400 acres. About 120 head of cattle right now, grade shorthorns mostly. 2 permanent hands, Colt Davies, and an older man named Pete Birch who's been with me 4 years. A 4-room house with a proper kitchen and a stone fireplace. A well that hasn't run dry in 9 years. Good pasture on the south end if the summer rains come decent. Helen was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "I need the afternoon to think." "Of course," he said. "Come back at 4 o'clock." He came back at 4 o'clock precisely, and she was waiting in the small sitting room off the front parlor rather than her room, which he took to mean something, though he was not certain what. She had a cup of tea in front of her, and there was a second cup waiting for him, which he took as well, though he was not a tea drinker by habit and held the small cup with the careful uncertainty of a man whose hands were made for rope and fence posts. "I have conditions," Helen Pritchard said. "I expected you would. First, this is a business arrangement to begin, and both of us go into it with clear eyes. I will not pretend otherwise." "Agreed." "Second, I have my father's books. His library, such as it was, 12 volumes, a Bible, and a small writing desk. They come with me." "There's room," he said. "Third." She paused here, and he saw the first real vulnerability in her face, the first place where the measured steadiness cracked just slightly. "My father left nothing, Mr. Ramsey. I do not say this for sympathy. I say it because I need you to understand that I am not bringing anything material to this arrangement except my own labor and my own intelligence, and I need to know that those things are considered sufficient." Something moved in Henry's chest. He was not sure he could name it. "They are more than sufficient," he said. "Fourth," her chin came up slightly, "I will not be an ornament. I will work. I will manage the household accounts if you allow it. I have some knowledge of bookkeeping from helping my father with his hardware store. I do not want to sit on a porch and look decorative." "I wouldn't know what to do with a decorative wife," Henry said honestly. The corner of her mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the nearest thing to one he had seen from her, and it changed her face in a way he noticed and then immediately tried not to think about. "Then we may understand each other," she said. They were married on Friday afternoon. The ceremony was performed by Judge Elias Moorfield at the courthouse on Congress Street, a brief legal proceeding that took 11 minutes from start to finish. Mrs. Dunbar was there as a witness, and Colt Davies, who had ridden in with Pete Birch, a weathered man of 52 with a gray mustache and the permanently squinting expression of someone who had spent 30 years looking into the sun. Pete had said nothing about the situation except, "Well, all right then," when Colt had explained it to him, which was approximately the reaction anyone who knew Pete would have predicted. Helen wore the best dress she owned. a dark green one with small pearl buttons at the collar, and she had done her hair up properly, and Henry had put on his good shirt and his cleanest vest, and they stood before the judge and said the words, and it was done. Henry signed the paper and Helen signed her name beside his in a clear, steady hand, and when Judge Moorfield said, "You may kiss your bride," there was a brief, impossible second of silence in which neither of them moved. Then Helen turned to face Henry and lifted her chin slightly, and he leaned forward and pressed his lips to her cheek, and she went very still for just a moment. And then it was over and they were married, and they walked out into the afternoon sun, where Tucson went about its business with perfect indifference to the fact that two strangers had just bound their lives together out of necessity and a 7-day deadline. Henry tied Helen's small trunk to the back of the wagon, and they rode out to the Double R in the late afternoon light, and for the first 20 minutes neither of them said a word, and the silence between them was not comfortable exactly, but it was not hostile either. It was the silence of two people who were not yet sure what kind of language they shared. "Tell me about your father," Henry said, because he needed to say something, and that seemed a decent place to start. Helen glanced at him sideways. "He was a practical man," she said. "He ran a hardware store in Prescott for 18 years. He was not given to sentiment, but he was fair. He taught me to keep accounts before he taught me to bake bread, which I think tells you something about his priorities." A pause. "He got sick in the autumn and was gone by January. It was quick, for which I am grateful." "I'm sorry," Henry said, and he meant it. Helen looked at her hands in her lap. "He would have liked this," she said quietly. "Not the circumstances, perhaps, but the practicality of it. He was always telling me that life is mostly problem-solving dressed up in different clothes." Henry thought about that for a while. "That's not a bad way to put it," he said. They arrived at the Double R as the sky turned that particular deep orange that precedes the dark, and Helen stood down from the wagon and looked at the ranch. The house was low and adobe, with a covered porch along the front and a kitchen garden that Henry had not paid enough attention to and which was overgrown at the edges. There were the cattle pens and the barn and the long sweep of pasture going south, and the mountains in the far distance, and the sky above it all enormous and pale at the edges and deepening toward purple at the center. "It's bigger than I imagined," Helen said. "I've been working it alone a good while," Henry said. "Some of it could use attention." She nodded, still looking. "Then we had better get started." He showed her the house. It was clean enough for a bachelor's establishment, which was to say it was functional and not filthy, but clearly lacked the consideration that a woman brings to a space. There were 4 rooms, the main room with the fireplace and the table and 2 wooden chairs, the kitchen with its iron stove and the pump sink that was one of the features Henry was most quietly proud of, a back room used for storage and laundry, and the bedroom. He stopped at the bedroom door. "I'll sleep in the storage room," he said. "I can clear it out and set up a cot. You take the bedroom." Helen looked at him steadily. "That is a generous offer." "It's a practical one," he said. "This is a new arrangement. You shouldn't have to navigate more than you're already navigating." She held his gaze for a moment in a way that felt like she was measuring something about him, something that mattered. Then she nodded. "Thank you." Henry cleared the storage room that night while Helen unpacked her trunk in the bedroom, setting out her father's books in a neat row on the windowsill, and placing the small writing desk against the wall beneath the window where the morning light would reach it. He could hear the quiet, precise movements she made as he carried boxes and sacks out to the barn, and there was something oddly companionable about the sound, about the knowledge that someone else was in the house while he worked, that it was not only his footsteps on the floor anymore. He lay on the cot in the cleared storage room that night and stared at the ceiling, and told himself very firmly that he needed to think about the bank payment on Saturday morning, and not about the fact that Helen Pritchard, Helen Ramsey now, had gray eyes that saw things clearly and a mouth that was careful until the moment it wasn't. Saturday came. Henry rode into Tucson and presented the marriage certificate to Mr. Aldous Webb at the Territorial Bank, who examined it with his usual thin precision and then stamped the loan document and handed Henry a new repayment schedule. The immediate crisis was resolved. The ranch was safe. Henry rode home feeling lighter than he had in a week, and he came through the door to find that Helen had reorganized the kitchen entirely, had found his account ledgers and spread them across the table, and was working through them with a pencil and the expression of a woman doing something she understood how to do. And the kitchen smelled of something cooking on the stove, something with onions and salt pork. And Pete Birch was sitting in the chair by the door eating a biscuit with the contentment of a man who had not had a decent biscuit in years. "Pete," Henry said. "She made biscuits," Pete said, as if this explained everything, and perhaps it did. Helen looked up from the ledgers. She was not wearing her good dress now. She was wearing a plain gray work dress, and her hair was pulled back more practically, and there was a smudge of pencil on the side of her hand. "I hope you don't mind," she said. "I started on the accounts. Your supplier charges are inconsistent. Someone in Tucson has been billing you at different rates for the same goods." Henry hung his hat on the peg by the door. "Which supplier?" "Hadley's Feed." She turned the ledger and pointed at a column of figures. "Look. March through June last year, 10 cents per bushel. July onwards, 12. No note about a price change." Henry looked at the numbers and felt a quiet, specific irritation he recognized as the kind that came from realizing you had been taken advantage of while you were busy looking in a different direction. "I'll ride to Hadley's Monday." "You could write him a letter," Helen said. "In writing it becomes a record. He can't deny having received it." Henry looked at her. "You're right," he said. She went back to the ledger. He went to the pot on the stove and looked into it. Salt pork and beans and onions and something fragrant that might have been a dried herb from the garden outside. "Did you find herbs in the kitchen garden?" he asked. "Under the weeds," she said. "You had thyme and sage and what I think might be rosemary, though it was hard to tell. I pulled the worst of the weeds. The garden has potential." "I never had much time for it," he admitted. "That's what I assumed," she said, not unkindly, just observationally. The way she said most things. They had supper together that evening, the two of them at the table in the main room with the fireplace going against the desert chill that came after dark even in May, and they talked about the ranch. Helen asked questions about the cattle operation with the same focused practicality she had applied to everything else, and Henry found himself explaining his plans for expanding the herd and his concerns about the summer grazing, and she listened with genuine attention, and occasionally said something that was either useful or asked a question that showed she had been listening more carefully than most people would have. At the end of it she said, "I think you need another hand during calving season." "Can't afford one right now," Henry said. "You could afford a part-time one if you renegotiate the Hadley's account and apply the difference. It's not much, but it adds up over 6 months. He looked at her across the table in the firelight and felt something he was not ready to name, something warm and quiet and slightly alarming. She was looking down at the table, tracing a grain in the wood with one finger, not aware of his attention, and her face in the soft orange light was something he wanted to keep looking at, which surprised him. He looked away and picked up his coffee cup. "I'll do the figures," he said. "Good," she said. May turned into June, and June into the long burning engine of an Arizona summer, and the double R moved through its rhythms of work and weather and necessity, and Helen moved through it all with a steadiness that Henry watched with a combination of admiration and something that was gradually, undeniably becoming more than admiration. She rose before dawn each morning and had coffee ready by the time Henry came in from checking the stock, and she managed the house with an efficiency that made it feel, for the first time since Henry had built it, like a home rather than simply a shelter. She wrote to Hadley's Feed in a precise, firm hand, and the rate dropped back to 10 cents within a week. She kept the accounts and found 2 other suppliers who had been billing inconsistently, and she negotiated by letter with a cool confidence that Henry found genuinely impressive. She tended the kitchen garden, and it responded to attention the way things generally do, producing enough by mid-July that she was sending preserved beans and pickled cucumbers with Colt when he went to town. But she also learned things. She did not pretend to know what she did not know, and she asked questions about cattle and pasture and water rights without embarrassment, and she went with Henry to ride the fence lines one morning in late June and sat her horse, a gentle bay mare Henry had loaned her, with more ease than he had expected. "You ride," he said. "My father kept a horse," she said. "I rode when I was younger. I'm rusty." "You don't look rusty." She glanced at him with that fraction of a smile. "You're being generous." "I'm being accurate," he said, and meant it, and did not look away quickly enough, and she saw that he meant it, and something shifted very slightly in her face. Something opened just a degree, and then they both looked back at the fence line and neither said anything more. Pete Birch, who was not given to observation but was not entirely without perception, said to Colt Davies one evening while they were mending tack in the barn, "You notice anything different about the boss lately?" Colt was quiet for a moment, threading a leather strip through a buckle. "I notice he whistles," Colt said. "He never used to whistle," Pete grunted. "She's good for the place," he said. "She's good for him," Colt said. Pete grunted again, which was as much agreement as he ever gave, and went back to the tack. There was an evening in early July, when the heat had been brutal all day and did not let up even after dark, when Henry found Helen sitting on the porch steps with a glass of water, her hair loose around her shoulders because the heat made anything else impossible, and he came and sat on the porch boards behind her without thinking, and they sat in the warm dark and listened to the desert sounds, the insects and the far-off cry of something wild, and she said, without turning around, "Do you regret it?" The question was simple, it was honest. It was the kind of thing Helen asked when she had been thinking something for a while and had decided the only decent thing was to ask it directly. He considered it the same way, honestly. "No," he said, "not for a single day." She was quiet. He could not see her face from where he sat, only the curve of her shoulder and the dark fall of her hair. "I don't either," she said, and her voice was softer than he had heard it, softer than the measured, practical tone she generally wore like a working garment. "I was afraid of it at first, not of you, of the circumstances, of being beholden to something I hadn't chosen for myself. And now?" He asked, and his own voice had gone quieter without him deciding to do that. She turned slightly, enough that he could see her profile against the dark. "Now I think that sometimes circumstances choose things for us that we would have been too cautious to choose ourselves." The silence that followed was not the uncertain silence of the beginning. It was the silence of two people who were sitting inside something they were just beginning to understand, something warmer and more complicated than a practical arrangement, something that had grown in the space between the morning coffee and the evening accounts and the hours on horseback and the conversations over supper that had gradually become the best part of Henry's day. He reached out, very slowly, and rested his hand on the porch board near her shoulder, not touching her, just near. She looked down at his hand, and then she moved just slightly so that her shoulder was resting against his knee, and they stayed like that in the warm dark and did not say anything else. And Henry thought that this was one of the most important things that had ever happened to him, this quiet contact in the desert night, and that it had arrived from a direction he had never looked in. The next morning they were both careful and practical and slightly formal with each other in the way that people are when something has shifted, and they are not yet sure whether to speak about it or let it settle first. And Helen made the coffee, and Henry brought in the wood for the stove, and Colt came in for breakfast, as he usually did on weekdays, and filled the room with his easy chatter about one of the young steers who had gotten himself tangled in the south fence overnight. And the ordinariness of it was in some ways a relief, and in others a source of a particular warm frustration that Henry carried around all day, while checking the pasture water and mending the barn door hinge and doing all the physical work that usually occupied his full attention, but that day could not quite reach the part of his mind that was still on the porch in the dark with Helen's shoulder against his knee. He came in at noon to find her at the writing desk, working on a letter, and she did not look up immediately, and he stood in the doorway and watched her write for a moment, the precise movement of her hand, the small line between her brows that appeared when she was concentrating, and he thought, "This is the woman I married. This specific woman, with her gray eyes and her sharp mind and her measured voice that went soft sometimes when she wasn't expecting it. And I would choose her. Not for the bank, not for the deed, for her." "You're staring," she said without looking up. "I am," he agreed and did not stop. Now she looked up. Her expression held that careful quality, that measuring quality, but underneath it there was something warmer and less guarded than it would have been 2 months ago. "Is something wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," he said. He took 2 steps into the room and she turned in the chair to face him, and he crouched down so they were at eye level, because it seemed important to be at eye level for this. "Helen, I need to say something." "All right," she said quietly. "When I came to Mrs. Dunbar's that Wednesday, I was looking for a solution to a legal problem. I want to be honest with you about that because you have always been honest with me about everything." He stopped, finding the words with the same care he had been putting into it all morning. "But that's not what happened. What happened is that I found you, and every day since then has been better than the day before it in a way that I didn't think was still available to me. And I don't want you to think I'm saying this because it's been 2 months and it seems like the right thing to say. I'm saying it because I've been sitting on it for 3 weeks, and if I don't say it now, I'm going to run out of room." Helen looked at him for a long time. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she had that stillness that was one of the most distinctive things about her, the quality of being entirely present without being restless. Then she said, "I've been sitting on the same thing." Henry let out a breath. "Have you?" "Yes." The measured tone was gone entirely now. Her voice was just itself without its armor. "I came to this thinking it was a problem to be solved, a situation. And then I found that it was not a situation at all. It was a life. It was you and the morning coffee and the fence lines and Pete eating biscuits and the way you talk about the land like it's something you're in conversation with, not just something you own." She stopped. Her gray eyes were bright. "I have not been unhappy, Henry, not for a single day, and I think that means something." He took her hand. It was the first time he had done that, taken her hand deliberately, not a polite gesture but a real one, and her fingers curled around his without hesitation. "It means a great deal," he said. She smiled. The full version of it this time, not the fraction of it, the whole warm thing, and it undid something in his chest that had been knotted tight for a long time. He leaned forward and kissed her, properly this time, not the brief press to her cheek in the courthouse, and she kissed him back with a sincerity that made the world very quiet and very clear. And when they separated, she was still holding his hand, and the letter she had been writing was forgotten on the desk, and neither of them minded at all. What followed was a summer that Henry Ramsey would remember for the rest of his life, not for any single dramatic event, but for the texture of it, the accumulated warmth of daily life with a woman he had fallen entirely in love with. He moved back into the bedroom. They did not make any announcement about this and did not need to, and Colt Davies had the grace not to grin too visibly the morning he noticed the storage room was being used for storage again, though Pete Birch caught the suppressed expression and gave him a look that communicated, without words, that making a production of it would be inadvisable. The ranch did well that summer. The rains came reasonably on schedule, the pasture held, and 3 good cattle trades in August brought in enough money that Henry was able to make the first annual loan payment ahead of schedule. And Mr. Aldous Webb received this development with the expression of a man who had expected nothing different but was mildly surprised anyway. Helen continued with the accounts and the kitchen garden and the practical management of the household, but she also rode out with Henry more regularly, learning the land, learning the names of the cattle that had names, learning the particular mood of the sky when the afternoon heat was building toward a storm. She had a gift for observation that Henry came to rely on, noticing things he walked past, the early signs of a lame hoof, a section of fence that was leaning more than it should, a change in the water level in the east tank that suggested the inlet was partially blocked. She learned to do these things without fanfare and without waiting to be asked, which was one of the qualities that made her invaluable, and also one of the qualities that made him love her in a specific, daily, inescapable way. They had an argument in late August, a real one, and it was, as most real arguments are, about something that was not the actual subject of the argument. Henry had made a decision about bringing in an additional 36 head of cattle from a rancher going out of business north of Tucson, without discussing it with Helen first, not because he meant to exclude her, but because it was a fast decision made in the field. Helen found out when Colt mentioned it at supper, and she went quiet in the way she went quiet when she was containing something rather than not feeling it. And after Colt left, she said very calmly and very directly that she had been managing the accounts for 3 months, and a decision of that financial magnitude affected the accounts, and she would appreciate being part of conversations like that. Henry started to explain his reasoning, which was that it had been time-sensitive, and she said that she understood time sensitivity, but a brief conversation or even a note sent back with Colt would have taken 5 minutes, and would she please not be treated like the financial decision stopped at the kitchen garden. Her voice was even, but her gray eyes were very bright, and he could see that this was not only about the cattle. "You're right," he said. She stopped. She had been ready for more argument, and his agreement caught her off guard. "Yes," she said, "I am. I will not do it again," he said. "I got into the habit of making decisions alone. I need to break it." She looked at him steadily. Some of the tension in her shoulders went. "Thank you," she said. "I mean it, Helen. I know you do," she said. "That's why I believe you." They were quiet for a moment. Then Henry said, "The cattle are good, though. The price was fair." The corner of her mouth moved. "Show me the figures tomorrow," she said. "I'll tell you if the price was fair." He showed her the figures the next morning, and she told him the price was very slightly above fair, which was almost better than fair, because it meant the other rancher had received something decent and Henry had also not overpaid. And the conversation turned into a broader one about the cattle operation and cash flow, and what a good winter might look like if the cattle prices held. And by the end of it, they were sitting at the table with the ledgers spread between them, and they were making plans together. Not Henry's plans with Helen consulting, but plans they were building in the same conversation from the same materials, and it was the closest Henry had come to understanding what partnership meant in the full sense of the word. September brought the beginning of autumn, and with it a visitor Henry had not expected. The visitor was a man named Dixon Hart, who arrived at the Double R on a Tuesday morning on a tall black horse, and wore the kind of coat that suggested he came from somewhere east and thought well of himself. He was perhaps 45, with a narrow face and the deliberate manner of a man who had thought carefully about every move before he made it. He said he represented an Eastern land investment company that was buying up rangeland in the Tucson area for consolidated cattle operations, and that he was prepared to make Henry a generous offer for the Double R. Henry told him the ranch was not for sale. Dixon Hart said that every ranch was for sale at the right price, and told him the price. It was a large number. Henry acknowledged internally that it was a large number. He also acknowledged that 2 months ago, before the bank situation was resolved, he might have been more vulnerable to a large number. He looked at this man on his tall black horse in front of the house he had built himself on land he had bought acre by acre, and he said again that it was not for sale. Hart rode away, but he came back on Thursday. This time Helen was in the yard when he arrived, checking the kitchen garden, and he addressed himself to her as though she were the more likely persuadable party, which told Henry something about Dixon Hart's method of operating. Helen listened to his offer with the same careful attention she gave everything, and then she said, in a tone that was perfectly pleasant and absolutely final, "My husband has already given you his answer, Mr. Hart, and I share it. The Double R is not for sale. Have a good day." Hart looked at her for a moment, recalibrating, and then looked at Henry, who was standing on the porch, and then looked back at Helen, who was already turning back to the garden with the unhurried manner of someone who has concluded a minor interruption and is returning to more important work. He tipped his hat with a tightness around his mouth that was not quite courtesy and rode away, and did not come back. That evening Henry told Helen what Hart had said on Tuesday, the full offer, the full number, because she deserved to know, and she listened and then said, "Was it tempting?" "For about 2 seconds," Henry said honestly. "Before I remembered what the ranch is." "And what is it?" He looked at her across the table. "Everything we're building," he said. She held his gaze and nodded once, a small, deliberate nod that carried more weight than most people's speeches. "Then we're in agreement," she said. October arrived with the first real cool in the air and the light turning golden and long across the pasture. One Friday evening Henry came in from riding the fence line to find Helen standing in the kitchen with her hand pressed flat against the counter, and an expression he had not seen on her before, something that was attempting to be its usual calm and was only partially succeeding. He stopped in the doorway. "What is it?" She looked at him. The expression resolved itself into something clear and warm and slightly overwhelmed. "I believe," she said with careful precision, "that we are going to need more room in the house." It took him half a second, then it landed. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took both her hands in his. "Helen, I'm fairly certain," she said. "I'll ride to Dr. Cole next week to confirm. Are you all right?" He asked, which was the first thing that came out, because he needed to know that before anything else. "I'm perfectly well," she said, and her voice was steady but her eyes were bright in a way that he recognized as happiness she was still deciding whether to let all the way in. "Just surprised. I hadn't expected it quite so soon." Henry brought her hands to his lips and pressed them there, and felt a fullness in his chest that had no word in his vocabulary. "Helen," he said again, because he couldn't think of anything better, and sometimes a person's name is the most complete thing you can say to them. She let the happiness in all the way then. He could see it happening, the careful, measured woman who had stood in the hallway of Mrs. Dunbar's boarding house with her defenses intact, letting something through that she could not calculate or control, and not minding. She moved forward and pressed her forehead against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arms around her, and they stood in the kitchen in the October light, while the stove ticked with heat, and the cattle moved somewhere in the far pasture, and the ranch went about its irrelevant business around 2 people who had stopped paying attention to it. Dr. Cole confirmed it in mid-October. Helen was entirely well, and the doctor said spring, probably April. Henry relayed this information to Colt and Pete said, "Well, all right then," in exactly the same tone he had used when told about the marriage, which was Pete's way of conveying that this was fine and also wonderful, and he had no more words for it. Colt was more expressive and said several things, none of which will be recorded here, but all of which were wholehearted and genuine. Henry wrote to Helen's aunt in Prescott, the only family Helen had mentioned, a woman named Margaret Kane, to tell her the news, and Margaret Kane wrote back a letter of 3 full pages that was warm and slightly breathless, and told Henry a great deal about what kind of woman Helen had always been, how precise and guarded and independent, and how underneath all of that was a warmth that she had protected carefully, and how glad Margaret was that someone had found their way past the protection. Henry read the letter twice and then gave it to Helen, who read it and got the bright eyes again and said, "Aunt Margaret has a gift for saying the things you'd rather she didn't." "She says things that are true," Henry said. Helen looked at him. "Yes," she said quietly, "she does." The winter settled over the Rincons with the particular blue clarity that Arizona winters sometimes achieve, cold at night and brilliant in the day. And the ranch slowed to its winter pace, and Henry and Helen had more evenings by the fireplace and more long conversations of the kind they had developed, winding through the ranch's future and books Helen was reading and Henry's memories of building the double R in the early years, the physical work of it. The things that had gone wrong and been fixed and gone wrong again, and Helen's memories of Prescott and her father's hardware store, and what it had been like to be an educated girl in a Western town where education in women was considered somewhere between unnecessary and suspicious. "Did you ever think about leaving?" Henry asked one evening. "Going east," she considered it. "I thought about it," she said. "After my father died, I thought about going to my aunt in St. Louis, but I have always been Western. I don't know how to explain it except that the light here is the right kind of light. The sky is the right size." She turned her cup in her hands. "I think I would have suffocated somewhere smaller." "You'd have been wasted somewhere smaller," Henry said. She looked at him with that measuring quality, but the measuring was affectionate now, familiar, the way you measure the people you have come to know thoroughly. "You say things like that and then look away like you haven't said them," she observed. "I'm working on that," he said. She smiled. "Good," she said, "because I like hearing them." November brought a cold that kept them closer to the house, and with it came one of the events that the Wild West of 1882 produced without apology or sentiment. A man came through the south pasture one evening at dusk on foot, which was unusual enough to notice. Colt saw him first from the barn and came to tell Henry, who went out to look. The man was perhaps 30, with a lean, travel-worn appearance and the hollow eyes of someone who had not eaten properly in several days. He was not carrying a weapon that Henry could see. He stopped when he saw Henry and said, carefully, that he was not looking for trouble. He was just passing through and would be grateful for water. Henry looked at him for a moment, reading the signs the same way he read weather signs, and decided that what he was looking at was a man who was exhausted and hungry and had nothing threatening in him at the moment. Henry told him to come to the pump and get water, and then Helen, who had heard from inside and had come to the kitchen door, said there was food and the man could sit on the porch and eat if he wanted, which he did. And he told them his name was Robert Freely, and he had come from Texas looking for work and had not found any in the last month and was making his way toward Yuma. Henry did not have a permanent position to offer but gave him a day's wage for a day's fence work and let him sleep in the barn that night. He was gone by first light, which Henry had expected, with a piece of bread and some jerked beef that Helen had pressed on him before bed. Henry found a brief, careful thank-you note scratched on a piece of bark near the barn door. "You didn't have to do that," Colt said when Henry mentioned it. "I know," Henry said. "Neither did she," Colt said, meaning the food. "I know that too," Henry said. "She's a good woman," Colt said. "I'm aware of that," Henry said, with a mildness that Colt recognized as complete agreement. It was around this time that Henry began to think about the house seriously, about expanding it. They needed more room, as Helen had said, and he was already thinking about a fifth room built off the back, properly heated and ventilated for a child, and perhaps a proper sitting room adjacent to the main room, because the house had been built for a single man and a single man's idea of sufficient space, which did not include anywhere to sit that was not also where you ate or cooked. He talked about it with Helen, and she had opinions, sensible ones as always, about where the addition should be and how the kitchen might be reconfigured to handle the increased household load. "If we extend the back wall out 8 feet, she said, drawing on the back of an envelope with the pencil she kept in her apron pocket, "we get the new room here, and we could close off this corner of the main room to make a proper small sitting area without losing the dining space." Henry looked at the drawing. "You know about construction?" he asked. "I know about geometry and about what makes sense," she said. "It's my father's hardware background. He made me understand measurements." He started the addition in November, doing the bulk of the work himself in the mornings and evenings when the ranch demands were lighter, with Colt and Pete helping on weekends. By December it was framed, and by the end of January it was weather-tight and plastered, a new room with a small iron stove of its own, and a window that faced east so the morning light came into it first. Helen stood in the finished room in early February, looking at the morning light coming through the east window, with one hand resting on the very visible curve of her abdomen, and Henry stood behind her with his hands on her shoulders, and neither spoke for a long moment. "It's right," she said. "It's right," he agreed. February and March passed in the particular anxiety that accompanies waiting for something important, and the ranch continued its work while Helen continued hers, slower now but no less purposeful, and Henry hovered in the way that men hover when they are trying to be helpful and are not always certain how, and Helen tolerated this with more patience than was probably her natural inclination, which Henry was aware of and appreciated. Dr. Cole came out to check on Helen in March and declared her well and on schedule, and told Henry, with a look that acknowledged the evident hovering, that the best thing he could do for his wife was continue working and let her be the capable person she so clearly was. Henry took this advice and stopped asking her twice a day if she was all right, and reduced it to once in the morning and once in the evening, which seemed to be an acceptable compromise. April came with the heat returning and the pasture going green in its brief spring window and the cottonwoods along the wash putting out their leaves, and on a morning in the middle of the month, Helen woke Henry before dawn with the information that it was time, and Henry rode for Dr. Cole at a pace that suggested the 7 days to find a wife had been nothing compared to the urgency of this particular errand. The birth was long but not dangerous, and Dr. Cole and a neighboring ranch wife named Clara Pritchard, who had experience with these matters, attended, and Henry waited on the porch in the early morning dark, and then the dawn and then the full morning, walking back and forth across the boards in a way that Pete Birch, who had come from the bunkhouse and was sitting on the fence with his arms folded, observed without comment. At mid-morning the sound from inside the house changed, and then there was a different sound, new and insistent and belonging to no one yet, and Dr. Cole came to the door and said, "It's a boy, Mr. Ramsey. Come in." Henry stood beside the bed where Helen lay, tired but present, entirely herself even in exhaustion, with a small wrapped bundle in her arms, and he looked at his son. And the small face had not yet decided entirely what it was going to be, but it was red and alive and furious about its recent arrival, and Henry sat on the edge of the bed, and Helen turned to put the bundle against his chest and said, "Hold him." He held him. The weight of him was specific and complete, and unlike anything else. His son's eyes opened briefly, unfocused, seeking, and Henry put one finger against the small fist, and the fist gripped it with a strength that was disproportionate to its size, and Henry looked at Helen, and she was watching him hold their son with an expression on her face that had dropped every last defense and was purely, entirely love. "What do we call him?" Henry asked. Helen had thought about this. "James," she said, "for your father's middle name, James Gerald Ramsey." Henry looked at her. He had told her his father's middle name in passing months ago, in the middle of a long conversation about something else entirely, and she had remembered it and held it and turned it into this. "How did you remember that?" he asked. "I remember everything you tell me," she said simply. He leaned forward and kissed her forehead, slowly and carefully, and she closed her eyes and he felt her exhale, the long letting go of effort. And then she settled back against the pillow with their son, and Henry sat beside them in the bright April morning and thought about Gerald Ramsey, who had borrowed money against a deed and left his son with a problem that had turned out to be the best thing that had ever happened to him, and felt something that was complicated and warm and full of forgiveness. Pete Birch, when informed from outside the window that it was a boy and both were fine, said, "Well, all right then," with a quality of satisfaction that carried more emotion in it than most people could fit into a full paragraph. Colt Davies made a sound that was not quite a word, and then recovered himself and asked if he could see the baby, and was allowed to look through the door for a moment, and came away with the slightly stunned expression of a young man who has just understood for the first time what any of this is actually for. The summer of 1883 was different in texture from the summer of 1882. It had the same heat, and the same long days and the same work of the ranch, but it had James in the center of it now. James, who was loudest in the early mornings and most contented in the evenings, and who by August had developed a quality of looking around at the world with his mother's gray eyes and his father's particular stillness, when something had his full attention. Helen adapted to motherhood with the same practical, intelligent approach she brought to everything, asking questions of Clara Prout and of her Aunt Margaret, who came to visit in June and stayed 2 weeks, and was everything her letters had suggested, warm and slightly overwhelming, and full of stories about Helen as a child that Henry listened to with the delight of someone who is filling in a picture. Margaret told him about Helen at 8 years old, keeping her father's receipts in a shoebox and correcting his addition. She told him about Helen at 14 writing letters to the territorial newspaper about the quality of Prescott's roads that were printed, with some surprise, by the editor. She told him about Helen at 20 being courted by a man with a good income and a dull soul, and turning him down with the explanation that she would rather be a partner than a decoration, which had been considered eccentric at the time. She was always going to need someone who understood that, Margaret said to Henry one evening on the porch while Helen was inside putting James to sleep. Someone who wasn't threatened by her being capable. A lot of men are. I'm not a lot of men, Henry said. Margaret looked at him with Helen's same quality of measuring assessment, which apparently ran in the family. Then she smiled, genuinely, warmly. No, she said. I can see that. When Margaret left, she embraced Henry at the wagon with the firm conviction of a woman who meant what she did, and told him in his ear that she was glad Helen had found him. And he said that he was the one who had been found, and she laughed and said that was the right answer. The autumn of 1883 brought the second loan payment, which Henry made without difficulty, and a good cattle sale that put them ahead of where they had expected to be, and a conversation about the future of the double R that went deep into the night around the fireplace, while James slept in the new room, and the autumn wind moved around the house with a low, steady voice. Henry talked about expanding the herd to 200 head by 1886. Helen talked about the kitchen garden being large enough now to supply not just themselves, but to sell at the market in Tucson, and had been doing preliminary figures on what that might bring in. Colt, who had sat in on these evening conversations with increasing frequency and had developed the habit of adding useful observations without being asked, said that the new railroad connection had changed what was possible in terms of cattle prices, and that Henry might think about timing the sales differently to take advantage of the seasonal fluctuations. Henry looked at him. When did you start thinking about this? Mrs. Ramsey got me to read a few things, Colt said, with a slight color in his freckled face. About markets. Henry looked at Helen. He asked me what I was reading, she said, without particular expression. Henry shook his head, smiling. I'm surrounded, he said, by people who are better at this than I am. You're the one who knows the land, Helen said. We're the ones who know the numbers. It's a good arrangement. It's a very good arrangement, he agreed, and reached across the table and took her hand, which had become a habit, a daily habit, the kind that you only notice when it's absent. In the winter of 1883 to 1884, Henry had a conversation that he had been putting off for longer than he should have, because there are conversations that require a certain amount of courage even for practical men. He sat down with Colt Davies one Saturday morning in the barn while they were working on the saddles and said, I need to ask you something directly. Colt looked up. You've been with this ranch 4 years, Henry said, and you're better than a hand. You know it and I know it. What is it going to take for you to stay? Colt was quiet for a moment. What are you offering? A share of the profits, Henry said. Not wages, a real share. 5% of the cattle income, which with the herd we're building toward will be a real figure. He paused. And eventually, if you want it, I'll sell you the north quarter when you've got the money at a fair price. 100 acres. Enough to start your own operation. Colt looked at him for a long time. That's generous, boss. It's practical, Henry said. The same way everything sensible on this ranch is practical. You leave, I lose the best man I have. Better to make it worth staying. Colt nodded slowly. All right, he said. Yes. Good, Henry said, and went back to the saddle. Colt went back to his own saddle. Then he said, Did Mrs. Ramsey suggest this? Henry did not look up. We discussed it, he said. Colt made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something more genuine than a laugh. "She's going to run this whole territory someday," he said. "Don't tell her that," Henry said. "She'll take it as a challenge." Helen, from the doorway where she had come to ask Henry about lunch, said, "I heard that," and went back inside, and Colt dissolved into laughter that echoed off the barn walls while Henry shook his head with the helpless warmth of a man who has been outmaneuvered by his wife again and cannot bring himself to mind. Spring of 1884 came with the wildflowers that made the Arizona desert briefly extraordinary. The poppies and the desert marigold, and the lupin spreading across the pasture edges in sheets of orange and yellow and purple. And James, who was almost a year old and had just graduated to pulling himself upright on anything available, was carried out into the yard on a morning of extraordinary beauty and sat in the grass and spent a significant amount of time staring at the flowers with the total absorbed attention of someone encountering a completely new idea. Henry and Helen stood beside him and watched. "Do you think he sees the colors?" Henry asked. "At his age?" "Yes," Helen said. "He sees everything. He's storing it all up." Henry looked down at his son in the wildflowers and then looked at Helen beside him in the spring morning, and she was not looking at him but at James, her expression entirely open in the way it was when she was not thinking about being composed, when she was just fully present in something beautiful. And he thought about the letter arriving on a Tuesday in the spring of 1882, and the 7 days, and the hallway at Mrs. Dunbar's boarding house, and the steady gray eyes that had looked at him without giving anything away for free, and the long road from that first measuring look to this morning with their son in the wildflowers. And he thought that if he had spent the rest of his life trying to design a life, he could not have designed anything as good as this. Helen turned and caught him looking, and she knew the expression by now, the particular quality of his attention when he was in the middle of thinking something that mattered. "What is it?" she asked. "I was thinking about the week we met," he said. Her expression shifted to the soft, slightly private version of itself. 7 days, she said. 7 days, he agreed, and I spent 6.5 of them thinking it was the worst situation I'd ever been in. And the last half day, I was sitting outside Mrs. Dunbar's at the bottom of the stairs trying to get my nerve up, he said, and I thought the worst that happens is she says no, and then I went up. Helen looked at him steadily. "I almost said no," she said. He blinked. "Did you?" "For about 20 minutes, while you were gone and I was thinking it over." She was quiet for a moment, and then I thought about what my father would say. He would say, "You have been waiting for the right circumstances, Helen, and the right circumstances have an annoying habit of not looking the way you expect them to." Henry was quiet. "He was right about most things," she said. James, in the grass, had grabbed a handful of wildflower stems and was regarding them with the intense judicial expression of someone preparing to eat something inadvisable. Helen bent smoothly and removed them from his fist, substituting her finger, which he gripped instead, looking up at her with the gray eyes and Henry's dark hair, and an expression of total certainty about the world that only very small children and very contented people ever achieve. "Hello," Helen said to him, in the voice she used only with James, softer and more musical than her usual voice. He said something back in the language of 11-month-olds that communicated approximately, "I am here and the world is very interesting, and you are the most important person in it." Helen laughed, and the laugh was the full, unguarded version that Henry had spent the better part of a year working for and never tired of hearing. The summer and autumn of 1884 brought the third loan payment and a particularly good cattle season, and Henry hired a second full-time hand, a capable older man named Jacob Foss, who had worked cattle all his life and knew exactly what he was doing and asked no unnecessary questions. Colt Davies, operating on his new share arrangement, had taken to riding the east boundary with an owner's attention to detail that was everything Henry had hoped for. Pete Birch, at 55 now, had moved from heavy field work to the barn and maintenance work with a dignity that required no discussion, and Helen made sure that his meals were always the best she could provide, and that his opinions were always solicited on ranch matters, because Pete's 30 years of range experience was not something you treated as retired even when his back required it. In October of 1884, Helen told Henry she was pregnant again. He received this information with more composure than the first time, which was to say he still crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took her hands, but this time he was smiling before he got there. "April again?" he asked. "March perhaps," she said. "Dr. Cole will tell us more." "A spring child," he said. "Both of them," she said. "You may have a type." He laughed. He had laughed more in 2.5 years with Helen than in the previous 5 years without her, and he knew this as a fact the same way he knew the weight of a good saddle and the height of the south pasture water in late summer. It was just a fact about his life now. Helen made him laugh. Helen made him think. Helen made him better at everything he did, not because she told him how to do it, though she sometimes helpfully pointed out improvements, but because having someone who saw him clearly and chose him anyway made a man want to be the version of himself they had chosen. March of 1885 brought the second child on a morning of cold, bright sun, a faster arrival than the first, which Dr. Cole said was often the way of it. Henry waited on the porch again with Pete beside him on the fence again, and this time the wait was shorter, and when the sound came it was different, or seemed different, and Dr. Cole came to the door with a different quality of smile. "A girl," he said. "Both fine." James, who was almost 2 and had been staying with Clara Pruitt during the birth, was brought home that afternoon and introduced to his sister in the careful, solemn manner of a toddler who has been told something important is happening and is doing his best to understand it. He looked at the baby in Helen's arms for a long time and then looked at Henry and said with great seriousness, "Baby." "Your sister," Henry said. "Her name is Ruth." "Ruth," James said, testing the word. Then he sat down very close to Helen's side and continued his examination of Ruth with the focused attention that was, already at 2 years old, recognizably his mother's quality of looking at things. Helen looked up from both of her children at Henry standing in the doorway of the room he had built off the back of the house, the east-facing room with the morning light, and her eyes were bright, and her face was more openly happy than he had ever seen it, and she said, "Come sit with us." He came and sat beside her on the bed, and Ruth was asleep in Helen's arms and James was pressed against his mother's side, and the late afternoon light was coming through the east window sideways and gold, and Henry thought, "This is the thing. This specific, accumulated, daily, undramatic, complete thing. This is what a life is." By 1886, the Double R had grown to its planned 200 head, and the loan was almost half paid off ahead of schedule, because Helen's management of the accounts had found savings and efficiencies that Henry alone would never have seen, and the cattle sales had been consistently good, and the kitchen garden had developed into something that contributed a real income at the Tucson market. Helen's stand at the Saturday market had become, in the estimation of several regular customers, the best place in Tucson to buy preserved tomatoes, and she had recently begun selling dried herbs in small paper packets that Clara Pruitt said were the most useful thing at any market, and why hadn't anyone thought of it before? Henry had ridden to the Tucson market with Helen on a Saturday in June, which he did occasionally now, partly to help with the wagon and partly because he liked watching Helen operate in town, the way she talked with people, the way she was known there and respected, the way she had made herself a figure of this community the same way she had made herself necessary to the ranch, by showing up and doing the work and being honest and being herself without apology or decoration. A woman at the market that morning, a newcomer, had asked Helen if she was the woman who had married Henry Ramsey for the bank clause, because the story had made its way around Tucson in various versions with the persistence that small-town stories always have. Helen had looked at the woman with complete steadiness. "I married Henry Ramsey because I chose to," she said. "The circumstances were what brought us to the same room. What happened after that was ours." The woman had not known quite what to say to that. Henry, who had been close enough to hear it, had said nothing. But on the ride back to the Double R, he had reached over and taken her hand where it rested on the wagon seat, and she had turned her hand and held his. And they rode the rest of the way like that in the easy silence that is one of the gifts of a real marriage, the kind that has been built in the daily honest work of two people who have decided to build it together. By the late autumn of 1887, the loan was paid in full. Not on the 10-year schedule. In 5 years, 3 months, and a handful of days, because Helen Pritchard Ramsey had found the money in the margins and the accounts and the careful, persistent attention to the difference between what things cost and what they were worth, and because Henry Ramsey had trusted her to find it. Henry made the final payment to Mr. Aldous Webb on a Thursday morning in November, and Mr. Webb stamped the document paid in full and handed it across the desk with the expression of a man who was impressed but too professional to say so. Henry walked out of the bank into the November morning with the deed to the Double R clear and unencumbered in his breast pocket, and stood on Congress Street in Tucson and looked at the sky above the buildings, the big Arizona sky that did not accommodate smallness, and felt the particular freedom of a man who has paid his debts and is owed nothing and owns everything he has worked for. He rode home and gave Helen the stamped document. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked up at him with the gray eyes, and in them he could see everything. The boarding house and the 7 days, and the Thursday he had climbed those stairs, and the 11 minutes in front of the judge, and the drive out to the Double R in the late afternoon light, and the evening on the porch in the warm dark, and every morning and evening an argument and agreement and birth and season and conversation since, all of it visible in that direct, clear, measuring gaze that had looked at him in a boarding house hallway and decided to take a chance. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. She set the document down on the table and stood up and walked to him, and he put his arms around her, and she pressed her face into his shoulder the way she had done that first time in the kitchen, after he had told her it mattered, and she said into the fabric of his shirt, "I am so glad I said yes." He held her, his hands on her back, her dark hair against his jaw, the Double R around them, and beyond it 400 unencumbered acres and the mountains and the big indifferent sky. "So am I," he said, "every day." James, who was 5½ and had inherited his mother's tendency to appear in doorways at significant moments, came in from outside with a handful of pebbles he wanted to show his father, and found his parents standing in the middle of the kitchen holding onto each other, and surveyed this with the philosophical acceptance of a child for whom this was simply a feature of the world, as ordinary and correct as the fact that the sun came up in the east. "Papa," he said. Henry looked up. "Yes, James." "Can I show you my rocks?" Helen laughed against Henry's shoulder. Henry reached out and pulled his son into the embrace with one arm, and James submitted to this with the tolerant dignity of someone who is too old for such things but will allow it on this occasion. And Ruth came in from the other room on her uncertain 2-year-old legs, drawn by the sound of her mother's laugh. And the kitchen of the Double R held all 4 of them in the November morning, which was ordinary and which was everything. The years that followed were not without their difficulties, because the working life of an Arizona cattle ranch in the 1880s did not offer itself to sentiment. There were 2 hard summers in the late 80s when the rains did not come properly, and the pasture suffered, and the water management that Henry had built into the ranch by careful practice over the years made the difference between serious loss and a bad season. There was a year when cattle prices dropped hard and they ran the ranch lean, and Helen's accounts were the thing that showed them exactly where the lean could be managed and where it could not. There was a spring when James was 7, when a fever moved through the household and Ruth, and then James were sick in ways that made Helen stand in the doorway of the children's room in the night with that quality of controlled fear that is the particular terror of parenthood. And Henry was beside her in those nights without being asked, and they waited together until the fever broke. But they were not broken by any of it, because they had built the ranch and the life, and each other too solidly for ordinary difficulty to collapse. And because there is a quality that comes from having started from honesty and built from there, a quality of being able to look at hard things directly and make sensible decisions about them, without the confusion of illusion to get in the way. In 1889, with the territorial land rush bringing new settlers and new energy to the Tucson area, Colt Davies, who had been saving on his share arrangement for 6 years, came to Henry with enough to purchase the North Quarter, the 100 acres Henry had promised him. The transaction was completed on a clear spring morning with 2 signatures and a handshake that held 6 years of genuine partnership in it. Colt rode out onto his own land the first afternoon, and Helen said she had never seen a man look so much like he was where he was supposed to be. "You did that," Henry said to her. "You offered it," she said. "You suggested I should," he said. She looked at him. "We did it," she said, with the mildness of someone correcting an error of attribution. He smiled. "We did it," he agreed. James Ramsey started school in the autumn of 1890, riding the 3 miles to Tucson with Colt Davies, who had caused to ride past the schoolhouse on his way to town on his supply days. He was a serious, thoughtful boy with his mother's gray eyes and his father's love of the land, and he took to learning with the same focused attention that characterized everything the Ramseys did when they decided something was worth their time. Ruth followed him to school 2 years later, small and dark-eyed, and with an energy that was more physical than her brother's, more given to motion and noise and the outdoor world, and she learned her lessons with a cheerful speed that suggested she was getting through them in order to get back outside. Helen had never stopped learning herself. Through the years she had continued to read everything she could get from the Tucson Lending Library, and had ordered books by mail through the new catalog services that the railroad had made possible, books on botany and economics and history and literature. And she and Henry had long conversations about what she read that were among the things he valued most about his daily life. The sense of a mind always moving, always adding things, always finding connections between ideas and the world they lived in. She was also involved, by 1890, with the women's social and civic improvement organizations that had formed in Tucson as the town continued to grow, not the purely social versions but the practical ones, the group that was working toward a better water system for the town, the group raising funds for a lending library with a wider collection. She went to meetings on Tuesday evenings when Henry or Colt could take her, and she came home from them with notes and plans, and the particular focused brightness she had when she was engaged in something that mattered. Henry never resented this. He thought it was right. He had known from the beginning that Helen was not a woman whose capacities stopped at the ranch boundary, and a man who loved that about her could not reasonably object to its expression. There were things he observed about her that he never said but held carefully, the way she still took her coffee black and sat with it at the table for exactly 15 minutes in the morning before the day properly began, as though the day required a formal agreement. The way she could always find whatever anyone was looking for in the house, as though she had a map of everything. The way she laughed at unexpected things, never the obvious comic moment but always something quieter and more particular. The way she still kept her father's 12 books on the windowsill in the bedroom, in the same order they had been the first night she arrived, and how the spines had faded now from the Arizona light and she had never moved them. One evening in the autumn of 1891, 29-year-old James came home from a gathering at the Pruitt Ranch, where the younger generation of the area's families regularly met, with a quality about him that anyone who had watched Henry Ramsey arrive home from room 6 at Mrs. Dunbar's boarding house would have recognized instantly. Helen noticed it first. She noticed most things first. She glanced at Henry across the supper table with the small lift of her eyebrow that was their private shorthand for, "Look at that," and Henry looked at his son's carefully composed face and the slight heightened color and understood. He said nothing that evening. Neither did Helen. They waited, because they knew from experience that some things needed to arrive in their own time. James told them on a Sunday morning after church that there was a girl. Her name was Caroline Foss, Jacob Foss's daughter, who was 22 and had grown up knowing the double R and its people and the shape of this country. And James had been in the same rooms as her for years without seeing her, and then one day he had seen her, and that was that. He said this with the directness that was his most characteristic quality, stating facts clearly, trusting that the facts were sufficient. Helen looked at her son and felt something vast and warm move through her. "Is she sensible?" she asked. James looked at her. "She's the most capable person I've ever met," he said, with a conviction that made Henry, who was listening from the kitchen doorway, turn away to hide his expression. "Then bring her to supper," Helen said. Caroline Foss came to supper the following Thursday, and she was indeed sensible and capable, and she sat at the double R table with the ease of someone who was comfortable with hard-working people in a working house, and she helped clear the plates without being asked, and she asked Henry a specific, informed question about the cattle operation that showed she understood something about it. And when Helen showed her the kitchen garden, she bent down and looked at the plants with genuine interest and asked which herbs were which. She was brown-haired and direct and had a laugh that was louder than you expected from her quiet face, and Henry thought she was good and said so to Helen that night after the children were in bed. Helen was already thinking about the house. "We'll need to add more rooms," she said. Henry looked at the ceiling. "We just finished paying the loan," he said. "I know," she said, "but we built this house for our life. Our life keeps growing." She turned to him in the dark, and he could feel the smile in her voice. "That is not a complaint." "I know," he said. He reached out and found her hand in the dark, which was still the easiest thing in the world. "It's the best possible problem to have." She squeezed his fingers. Outside the Double R's new rooms and wide-porched adobe house, the autumn night was clear and cold, the stars enormous over the rincons in the way that Arizona stars are enormous, as though they have grown accustomed to the sky being large enough to need filling. The cattle were in the south pasture. The kitchen garden was put to bed for the season. The books were on the windowsill. The accounts were balanced on the table in Helen's clear, precise handwriting. Everything was where it was supposed to be, and everything had its name, and the name of the man beside Helen in the dark was Henry Ramsey, and she had said yes to him 10 years ago in a boarding house hallway with the full knowledge that it was a practical arrangement, and the certain knowledge, which she had kept to herself, because it was too soon and too large and too much like the thing she had always protected, that it might become something else entirely. It had become something else entirely. It had become everything. In the spring of 1892, James Ramsey married Caroline Foss in the Tucson church on a morning that was bright and clear and perfect in the specific way that spring mornings in the Arizona territory could be perfect when they chose to be. Helen sat in the front pew beside Henry and watched her son stand before the minister with the steadiness and seriousness that had always been his most essential quality, and watched him turn to Caroline with a look that made Helen press her hand to her mouth for just a moment before she composed herself. Henry put his arm around her. She leaned into him and let herself feel it fully, this happiness that had grown from that first terrible and wonderful week 10 years ago, and had accumulated since into something larger than either of them had been when they began. Ruth, at 10 years old, sat on Henry's other side in her good dress with her dark eyes taking in everything, already composing some private judgment about the ceremony that she would share later with opinions and specificity. Ruth had the quality of opinions. She had, Henry thought, her mother's capacity for assessment and her own very particular directness about expressing it. She would be formidable. She was already formidable at 10. After the ceremony, after the celebration in the church hall with the neighbors and friends, and the people who had become the texture of this life, after Colt Davies made a toast that was warm and slightly longer than it needed to be and entirely sincere, after Pete Birch sat in the corner and ate a considerable amount and said nothing, but watched the whole room with an expression that communicated deep, complete satisfaction. After Helen danced with Henry on the cleared floor to music from a fiddle and a guitar, and he was not graceful but he was present, entirely there with her, his hand warm at her back and his eyes on her face, after all of it, they rode home in the early evening to the double R under a sky that was going from blue to orange to the deep purple that precedes the dark. The house was quiet for the first time in a while, James at the Foss house, until his and Caroline's new rooms at the north end of the double R were properly finished, Ruth asleep upstairs with the speed of the thoroughly tired. Henry and Helen sat on the porch in the evening dark, which was where they had always come back to when they needed to be with each other without the day between them. Helen had her feet up on the porch rail, which she would not have done in company, and which Henry found endearing beyond reason. The wedding glass was empty beside her. Henry was in the old chair that had been on this porch since the first year, the one he kept meaning to replace and never did because it had exactly the right resistance and the right angle. 10 years next month, Helen said. 10 years, he agreed. She turned her head to look at him. In the dark her face was the familiar face it had become, the face he knew in all its versions, composed and unguarded and amused and intent and sleeping, and always, beneath whatever it was doing on the surface, completely honest. "Are you happy, Henry?" she asked. The question was simple. She was not asking for reassurance. She was asking the way she asked everything, because she genuinely wanted to know, because she was still interested in the actual truth of things rather than the comfortable version. Henry looked at her in the dark and thought about Gerald Ramsey's letter arriving on a Tuesday morning in 1882, and Mrs. Dunbar pointing at a staircase, and turning his hat in his hands at the door of room 6, and riding to the courthouse in the borrowed suit with Colt and Pete behind them like a small, earnest delegation, and the first morning in the kitchen with her ledgers spread across the table and Pete eating biscuits in the corner, and the porch in the warm dark when she had put her shoulder against his knee and something had changed, and the moment in the kitchen when he had crouched down to be at eye level and found words for what had been accumulating in him for 3 weeks, and April mornings with wildflowers and 2 children with gray eyes looking at a world that was new and whole and worth examining, and 10 years of accounts and fence lines and arguments and agreements and all the daily work of a life built deliberately, honestly, with someone who never gave anything for free but who had, over time and without ceremony, given him everything. "Yes," he said, "I am happy." She looked at him for another moment, the measuring look, the honest look. Then she turned back to the dark and the desert and the mountains she had said once were the right size, the right light, and she smiled the full version of her smile, the one he had been working for from the first day and had never stopped being glad to earn. "Good," she said. "So am I." The double R was quiet around them. The stars were out in their Arizona abundance. Somewhere in the south pasture, a horse moved through the dark with the sound of grass and soft ground. The house behind them held their life in all its accumulated forms, the books on the windowsill and the accounts on the table and the children sleeping and the new rooms being built for the next beginning. Everything was here. Everything was theirs. Everything had been built from one letter, 1 week, 1 staircase, and 2 people who had looked at each other honestly and chosen to find out. There was nothing left open. There was nothing unfinished. There was only this, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was the thing that had been waiting at the top of those stairs all along.